Hi everyone, I'm Grace and I am on the activism and outreach team here at WWF. And as part of our Women's History Month programming, today I'm joined by Dr. Hahrie Han, whose work and experience have helped shape so much of my own understanding of organizing and building movements. A really quick bio on Dr. Han before I let her introduce herself. Um, So Dr. Han is the inaugural director of the Agora Institute, the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Professor of Political Science and faculty director of the P3 Research Lab at Johns Hopkins University. She's the author of multiple books and has led and partnered with a wide range of organizations and movements across the world. She specializes in the study of civic and political participation, social movements, collective action, and organizing, particularly as it pertains to democratic revitalization. She received her PhD in American politics from Stanford University and her BA in American history and literature from Harvard. She is the daughter of Korean immigrants and grew up in Houston, Texas. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Han. Hi, Dr. Han.
Hi, Grace. Good to see you.
Great seeing you. Thanks so much for joining us today. Do you want to just give like a expanded kind of just background about yourself and just kind of what you're here to talk about today?
Sure. So thank you, first of all, for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. I'm really looking forward to it. And as Grace said, I wear multiple hats. I'm a professor of political science at Johns Hopkins University. I direct an institute called the SNF Agora Institute that is dedicated to strengthening global democracy, but with a particular focus on the agora, or the interspecial spaces that knit people together into community, as foundational to making democracy work. And I direct a research lab called the P3 Lab. And we call it the P3 Lab because we're trying to understand how you make the participation of ordinary people possible, probable, and powerful. So people have to be able to participate, they have to want to participate, and then it has to matter. And so a lot of the work that we do is trying to understand how we create the vehicles that pull people off the sidelines into public life and then translate that into the kind of political influence that they want, particularly with a focus on low-income communities of color, mostly in the United States, but all over the world.
I'll probably say this a few times, but we're so excited to have you here. So I just want to kind of, before we jump into some of the questions that we've prepared for today, I do want to take a minute to address the sea of anti-Asian racism and violence that we've been experiencing, specifically the 6 Asian women who were murdered in Atlanta last week, and the recent spike of events from the Bay Area to New York to everywhere else in our country. And I know just as complicated and rich and different the Asian American experience is, it's full of different histories, struggles, and achievements. So the many of the reactions and emotions that I've been sharing and holding space for within the AAPI community in recent days have been a reflection of that. And I know for me, like many other first generation AAPI kids, my immediate thought was my parents. And it's like this weird thing when you turn a certain age and you're just like constantly worried about your parents. And kind of issues like this really bring that kind of worry forefront. Like many immigrants, my parents immigrated from Korea to the States in the late 80s. They had the dream of seeking opportunity to provide a better life for themselves and for my brother and myself. And I know that in your bio, you often mention that you are the daughter of Korean immigrants. What does that mean to you, and how has that been reflected in your work so far?
Yeah, it's such a privilege to be able to have this conversation in this moment with you, Grace, just because I think that a lot of the experiences that you described as a child of immigrants is very similar to my own. So like you say, I think I always mention the fact that I grew up as a daughter of Korean immigrants because it's really hard to separate the lens that I have on the world from the experience that I had growing up as a child of immigrants. And I think there's a couple of reasons why I think that's true in the kind of work that I do. So let me mention that, and then I want to circle back to this particular moment that we're in right now. So in general, I think, in studying movements, I think one of the things, part of the reason why I think I was attracted to studying movements is because one of the things I learned as a daughter of immigrants is just the transformative potential of being human, you know? And I know that sounds kind of silly in a way, but it's such a core part of the immigrant experience. And I think in a way that I think is different from people who don't grow up as children of immigrants in the same way. And so my parents immigrated to the United States in the early 1970s. At the time, Korea was very much still a developing economy. And so when they came, they showed up with like almost literally the proverbial kind of $100 in their pockets. And my dad landed in O'Hare Airport and he was by himself and he had $100 and he had to get himself out to the suburbs of Chicago. And he was shocked to find that the bus ticket that would take him to Chicago was going to cost like $40. And he was like, oh my gosh, I only have $60 left to live on, to eat, you know, to do all the other things that one needs to do. And my parents basically had to scrape their way together without having a lot of the social networks. And so, you know, my dad delivered Chinese food on his bike. He mowed people's lawns. My mom cleaned people's houses, and they just had to figure out how to make it. And I think so much of the experience that I saw growing up, not because my parents ever said the words to me, was just this idea that part of what we do as humans is try to remake ourselves so that we can remake our families and remake the world around us. And so I think I just grew up with that sense of transformation, which is so core to how social movements work, that when I learned about social movements, I think it spoke to something that I had experienced. The second thing I think is just also that growing up as a daughter of Korean immigrants in Texas meant that as a kid, I just had a very complex experience of how power works in our society. And, you know, there's an old joke that sort of says, you know, who discovered water? You know, and the answer is, well, I don't know, but it wasn't a fish, right? And the idea is that we're all fish kind of swimming in water, but we can't see the water. Most fish can't see the water around them, right? Because it's like the air that we breathe. And I think one of the things about being an immigrant meant that you can't see the water that you're swimming in unless you're denied that water, you know. And I think that being an Asian woman in a relatively conservative community meant that there are ways in which I just had a different experience from some of the white kids that I grew up with. And I wouldn't have had the language as a kid to know that it was about power, it was about race, or it was about gender, or any of these other things. But when I began to learn about them, I thought, oh, well, that makes sense in a way that I think I hadn't really understood in the past. And so I think then kind of when we think about moments like we're in right now, Grace, I think you're exactly right that, you know, as the events unfolded last week, the first thing I did was think about my parents who still live in Texas. They're older Asian couple living by themselves in Texas. But then I also thought about my children, you know, who are multiracial Asian children growing up in the United States. And, you know, I'm sure like you, having grown up as an Asian woman in the United States, like so many of the experiences that are being talked about in the media are experiences that we've all had, you know, and so there's a way in which the national conversation is catching up to something that we've all had to live with for a very long time. You know, but at the same time, it kind of raises the complex ways in which the experiences that we all carry with us are so intertwined with each other, you know. And I think that that's one of the things that I really hope will come out of the conversation that's been able to emerge, is that it's not just that Asian women were targeted in this particular instance, but that the experience of being an Asian woman is so intertwined with the experience and the structures of race and class and workers and, you know, everything else that it means to you know, to exist and to live in our society right now. And I hope that we're able to agitate a broader conversation around that.
Yeah, it was funny because I was kind of writing this introduction and I was trying to avoid all the isms while still acknowledging just like the foundation that they lay for some of these experiences. But thank you for sharing that. And I love that you brought up this idea of power and how that's kind of affected like the structure of our society in different sectors. And you've said that the climate crisis is a problem of power and that there's a misalignment between motivation and authority. Can you elaborate on that and explain how people and organizations can reconfigure their resources to build the authority and capacity to make the change we need to make?
Yeah, you know, so when I first actually got into political work, like I thought, you know what, like I don't want to work on organizing. I thought like I want to work on policy because policy is what really makes change, right? And so I was really interested in education and social policy at the time. This is in I don't know, probably like the late '90s when I was coming out of college. And so I thought like that's, I think there's a gap between the world as it is and the world as it should be. And if I want to try to close that gap, the most useful thing I can do is try to work on policy that's going to be able to close that gap. And so I went and worked in DC and got involved in some political campaigns. And to my surprise, the first thing that I learned in doing that work is the problem is not policy, but policy is downstream from power, And so if I really want to work on the problems that I care most about, I need to be working on problems of power, So what does that mean? So as you pointed out, I think of power as a problem of power as being a situation where there's a misalignment between motivation and authority, right? So what that means is that the people who want the change the most don't have the authority or capacity to make the change that they want. Or another way to put it would be that the people who have the motivation, the authority or capacity to make the change that's needed don't have the motivation, And so solving a problem of power is essentially figuring out how do we bring motivation and authority into alignment, right? How do we bring the motivation to make the change together with the authority and capacity to make it? And that's fundamentally what movements do, right? So one way to think about a movement is to say a movement is about reconfiguring the resources that a group of people have who, like a group of people who want to make change. What are the resources that they have? How can we reconfigure them so that they develop the authority or capacity that they need to make the change that they want? And so to me, like when I think about problems of like the climate movement, for example, I feel like one of the things that frustrates me sometimes about the climate conversation is that there's so many times when it feels like people feel like it's a challenge of designing the right policy that's going to get the right people to vote for it so that we're going to win, And all the data in political science, which is, like I'm an academic by training, shows us that if you make a policy change without changing the underlying power configurations, that even if you can like develop, get a big coalition to pass that policy itself, the way in which that policy gets implemented to actually change people's lives is going to reflect the underlying power dynamics that exist in society. So if we are able to pass climate legislation, let's say, in a way that doesn't remove the fundamental power of fossil fuel companies, then what's going to happen is that the way that policy gets implemented over time is going to reflect the power of fossil fuels, And so that's what I mean when I say that the climate movement is fundamentally a problem of power. And so the challenge is not just to develop the right policy instruments and develop the coalitions that you need to pass those policy instruments, but to fundamentally reconfigure the way that we think of power in the system that we're trying to remake. And there's so much in that we could unpack, right? Like how do you begin to sort of reimagine what a different power structure looks like, and then how do you begin to make it so? But that to me is part of what's so exciting about how movements work.
I wanted to just like clap along everything that you just said. But I think that is such an interesting way to think about kind of movements as reconfigurations, because that's ultimately what we're doing. And we've seen in the past couple of years a lot of these big social movements being driven and led by women and people of color, including both the Me Too and Black Lives Matter movement. So kind of expanding upon what you just said, how do people who are in a power down or marginalized position build movements to make this change? And how are they redefining or reconfiguring leadership in the process?
Yeah, so one of the really interesting things that I've learned from the research that we've done, and just to kind of step back and give a little bit of a broader view on that, is a lot of the work that my colleagues and I have done in our research lab is partnering with grassroots organizations all over the world, and then kind of digging into their work to understand like what makes some more effective than others, and we've kind of examined that question in a variety of different ways. And one of the questions that comes up, right, is because there's so much conversation, especially in movements on the left, where people say, oh, you should let frontline communities lead and things like that. And then sometimes there are other people who might because of the sort of structures of the different isms that you referred to earlier, that sometimes it's sort of hard to advance that conversation and let frontline communities really lead. And so one of the things that emerged from our research that I think was sort of interesting to me is that, let's say, for example, we were to put aside the kind of moral and just reasons why you would want to let frontline communities lead, is that what we found was that even from a purely strategic perspective, movements that are led by the communities that are most affected or most in need of the change are the ones that are most likely to be successful. And here's why, right? It's because there's every movement that is trying to shift a power dynamic is fighting an uphill battle, just by definition, right? Like, power doesn't give up power easily, right? And so if you're fighting an uphill battle, one of the things that means is that the work that you're doing is inherently unpredictable, right? So at some points, it's not like you go up to the door of power and you knock on the door and say, excuse me, can you give me some of your power? And they're like, oh, sure, thank you for asking so nicely. And they step aside and let you walk in, right? Like, it never happens, right? Instead, what happens, they slam the door in your face, right? Or they challenge you, right? As you're able to kind of get up to that door of power. And so the question what we found in a lot of our research is that what really differentiates an effective movement from one that's less effective is not how good their plan is in terms of how are they going to go knock on that door, right? But it's instead, how do they react when someone slams the door in their face, right? So in other words, when your power is challenged, what capabilities do you have to be able to react and proactively kind of advance your power strategy in that moment, right? So when the conservation movement is trying to advance a piece of work and their plan doesn't go as expected, which happens almost all the time when you're working in politics, right? Then what tools and what capabilities do you have to respond in that moment? And that's a real test of power, right? And what we found is that what tends to happen is, in that moment, you have to have leaders who are equipped to act both with urgency, creativity, and strategy, right? And it happens that there's a correlation or a relationship between organizations and movements that are grounded in the needs of the people who need the change the most and their capacity to respond with creativity and imagination and urgency in those moments of challenge, right? So if I'm a professor at Johns Hopkins University. I have this enormous amount of privilege, right, from doing that. And so I care a lot about making a lot of changes. But, when my power gets challenged at the end of the day, I get to go home to my nice home and my nice job. And, I don't have the same kind of urgency as someone who's in real need of having that crisis kind of fixed, And so when movements are led by people that have that sense of urgency, that have that sense of saying, we can't say, oh, well, we tried, right? We can't just double down on what we did before. That's where the creativity and urgency and kind of ability to respond agentically and strategically in a moment really comes from. And so that's part of the reason that I think we're seeing so many movements, not only in the United States, but all over the world, led by, as you would say, kind of people who are in that power down relationship, right? Because they're the ones that don't have the capacity to say the world as it is good enough. Right. And they have no choice but to say, we have to be reimagining another world. And then we have to be trying to figure out on behalf and with our people how we can begin to make that world a reality. And so I've just been really heartened to see how much, I think all the ways in which the field of organizing and movement building has really been changed and pushed and developed by women and women of color who are leading all sorts of movements, I think, to be better, to be stronger, to be more powerful in a variety of different ways.
Yeah. I have a follow-up question to that.
Yeah.
But I might jump ahead and come back to it, if that's okay, just because totally. What you said is something that's actually been on my mind recently, just about the theory of kind of abundance and how that is a different way of structuring and challenging the system as it's set up. And you often quote the Jewish philosopher Maimonides. I was like, who said, "Hope is to believe in the plausibility of the possible as opposed to the necessity of the probable," which I think is such a powerful statement and such a driving force of, some of this creativity and imagination that we're seeing within these new movements. Can you just talk a little bit more about, what that quote means to you and how you see the climate justice movement through that lens?
Yeah, I love that quote, which is why I use it so much. But I think so. Let me sort of step back and say how I kind of think about it in general, and then what I think it means in the context of the climate justice movement. So, you know, another. I mean, part of the reason why I became a political scientist, right, is because I think that that notion of hope is fundamental to how democracy should work. And I'm not saying that's necessarily how it has worked throughout history, but it's how it should work, right? And so at the heart of the promise of democracy is this notion that if we put people into collective settings in which they're able to join with each other, that they will overcome their natural instincts to be self-centered, selfish, short-sighted people, right? And instead find common purpose and work together for the common good, And so Madison in the Federalist Papers wrote, but what is government but the greatest of all reflections on humankind? If men were angels, men, because men at the time, right, is what they're talking about. But if men were angels, no government would be necessary, right? And the idea is that, we as human beings, we're not born with the capacities that it takes to make democracy work, right? We come out and naturally we tend to want to be around people who are like us, right? We tend to be kind of short-sighted. We tend to be a little bit selfish, right? These are all things. But that what we found throughout human history is that if you put people into the right kind of collective setting, that people can rise to the occasion, right? If we design that setting correctly, right? So that when people join with each other in their communities, when people join with each other in movements and in groups, then they're able to kind of find a sense of shared purpose that invites all of us to reach for our quote unquote kind of better angels, And I think that I fundamentally believe that there's a yearning that people have for that kind of connectedness, for that kind of belongingness, and for that kind of sense of meaning in their lives. And that part of the challenge in so many of the movements and organizations that we see is that people aren't given the opportunity to act and find and discover that sense of belonging and meaning that I think people fundamentally want, And so when I think about that lens in the context of the climate justice movement, part of the challenge that I have is this question of where are the places where people are coming together and are invited to find that sense of common purpose? Where are the places where people are coming together and invited to find that sense of their better angels, so to speak, And there's a story that I tell sometimes about the women who were the kind of foremothers of the temperance movement in the United States. And the temperance movement was actually it was started as a movement that was designed to fight domestic violence in the United States. So though, a lot of women were seeing in the late 19th century that men would go out and they'd get drunk and they'd come home when they were drunk and they'd beat their wives. And so they thought, well, if we want to stop domestic violence, what we have to do is stop alcoholism. And if we want to stop alcoholism, what we have to do is fight for temperance, right? And so I'm not advocating temperance, just to be really clear here, right? But what was really interesting about the way that they started the movement was that there's this woman who traveled all over the United States, and she would invite people in communities across America to say, look, if you want to join a movement for temperance, there's 3 things that you have to do. The first is you take a personal pledge to swear off alcohol, right? So sort of show us that your values are aligned with ours. The second thing that you have to do is join with a group of people in your community to try to shut down a bar. And then once you do that, whether you win or lose, the third thing that you have to do, the third thing you can do is then join the national movement, right? And so the question is, why was she asking people to try to shut down a bar in their community, right? Because if you know how a constitutional amendment for temperance is passed, it has nothing to do with whether or not Joe's Bar in any town USA is open, right? A constitutional amendment is a function of how many votes you get in Congress, right? And how many states that you get to sort of sign this amendment, right? And so it has nothing to do with whether or not the bar is open. But what she wanted was that before people would join the national movement, she wanted them to have the experience of collective action, right? She wanted them to have the experience of working with others to try to get something done in their community. So it didn't matter if Joe's bar was open or closed, but what mattered was that people realized if I work with others, I can do something more than if I try to work alone, right? And so the question, in a way, when I think about, well, where are the places where we're beginning to make the plausible more possible and finding that hope, is the question I think for the climate justice movement is what's the Joe's bar? You know, where are the places where people are coming together to learn this experience that when they work with each other, they can do more than when they work alone?
Thank you for that. I like love your like kind of the instances and like the examples that you share. I think they're just such a wide range of just kind of pulling from history and philosophy. Um, so I'm going to go back to the previous question, just about kind of like redefining some of what's expected of a traditional leadership role. And as we're seeing more of movements being led by young people and women, people of color, how can those who have historically had a seat at the table or have automatically have been assumed to have a seat at the table be thoughtful and effective allies when these movements and collective groups organize?
Yeah, so this gets a little bit back to the way that I think about power. So we talked a little bit about power as kind of this mismatch between motivation and authority, but here's the other dimension of power that I think a lot about, which is the idea that in order to understand power, you have to understand power as being dynamic. And I think that often we're tempted to think about power as a static trait of an organization or a person, right? So we might say, this person is power, Joe Biden is powerful, Donald Trump is not because he's out of office, right? Or we might say that the far right is powerful and the far left is not, or whatever. I don't know. Like there's different, kind of tropes that people have out there. And I want to challenge that view, right? So the way that I think about power is that power is a dynamic exchange of interests and resources, right? So I have power over you if I have resources that act on your interests, and you have power over me if you have resources that act on my interests, right? So as a professor, I can stand in front of a classroom and I might have power in that instance, right? Because I have resources, namely grades, that act on my students' interests, right? And so like in that context, I have power, right? But I'm the same person, and I could go to, the example I always use is like United Airlines, right? And when my flight gets canceled, I call up United Airlines and say, hey, how could you cancel my flight? And they're like, we don't care about you, you little peon, right? And so I'm the same person. I haven't changed, but in one context I have power, in another context I have no power, right? So the first thing is to kind of think that like power is not a static trait, it's a dynamic exchange of interests and resources. Now, if we think about it in that way, then the question is, okay, how can I become an effective ally? Well, the question is really a question of how do I use the inherent power that I have, right, to be able to lift up the power of other people. And one thing to think about power is that power doesn't have to just be an instance in which I use my resources to force you to act in a certain way. We can also decide to share power when we mutually each of us decide to use our resources to act on each other's interests, right? And so that really, to me, is at the heart of what it means to build solidarity, right? Solidarity is a relationship in which two people or two groups decide we're going to use our resources to act on each other's interests. Now, here's why that's so hard, right? It's because I have to then be able to say your interests are as important as my interests, right? And that's what solidarity means. And I think that's where a lot of allies sometimes get challenged, right? When they're challenged to really say the interests of my allies are as important as my own interests. And I'm willing to use my resources to act on their interests just as much as I'm willing to use my resources to act on my own interests, right? And it's kind of like being in a marriage or being in a long-term relationship or something like that, or any kind of partnership where I have to be able to say my partner's interests are as important as my own interests. And so, as a family unit, we have to say that we're going to collectively decide we're going to commit our resources to act on each other's interests, which means sometimes, we do things that we wouldn't do ourselves because our partners want us to, and I think that's where I think the question I always ask people who are entering into that relationship of allyship is that, are you really prepared to say their interests are as important as your own interests, and what does it mean for you to commit your resources to that? So I guess I think that's one of the things that as we move into a moment in our history where we're really trying to figure out how do we make a pluralistic, multiracial democracy work, that question of how we build solidarity across all different kind of lines of difference, I think is fundamental to the next generation of organizing that we're going to see. And that question of what solidarity means, I think will be at the forefront, not only of things like the climate justice movement, but of so many of the movements that we see out there.
Thank you for that. That's really great insight. I'm going to move to a question from the audience that we received via Facebook. Dr. Han, can you speak to how personal stories can be powerful in generating bold climate action?
Yeah, absolutely. So stories play a really powerful role in movements. A lot of times organizers will say that movements have 3 parts to them, and the 3 parts are story, strategy, and structure, right? So you have to have a story or a narrative about why you're doing what you're doing. You have to have a strategy for how you're going to turn your resources, what you have into what you want. And then you have to have a structure through which that happens, right? And so stories operate at multiple levels within a movement. At one level, it's about, what's the big story of the movement, right? Why are we doing our work in the way that we're doing it, right? And why is there change needed? But then there's also stories that operate at a micro level, in the sense of how can I build on my own story to help draw other people in and pull them off the sidelines. And I think the research shows that story is really powerful at all those different levels. But to the question, I think one particular way in which it's powerful in the context of the climate movement is that climate is an issue, as many issues are, and so I don't think climate is unique in this context, that has 2 dimensions to it, I think, that make it complicated. One is that it can often seem remote and far away, right? And so people have to feel like this is an issue that I have a certain kind of urgency and that I want to work on now, right? And the second is that it can feel like it's about something that's not people. And I think, sometimes the kind of image of people have of the climate movement as being about people hugging trees or about polar bears, means people are always saying it's great. I mean, I love polar bears and all, but I also really love my children and I kind of want to save them and I think part of the challenge for the climate movement is to sort of make it human, right? Is to make it feel like this is not about something that's far off and distant, or it's not about, our own livelihoods and our own humanity, right? It's fundamentally about who we want to be and what is the world that we want to create around us, right? And stories are a really powerful way of being able to make those connections and make visible the relationships and connections that people may not necessarily see without having the stories there. I think it sort of makes vivid an issue that can sometimes seem abstract to people that may not be thinking about it all the time. And so in that sense, I think personal stories can be really powerful.
Yeah, I feel like stories are also they're extensions of ourselves and our beings, and through that we're able to kind of build the relationships and bring the empathy needed. That's often sometimes left out of the conversation when it is around climate. And I think we have one more question from Facebook that I will ask you before asking you the last question that we have for today. When you speak about finding the places where people gather and find a place of belonging, that reminds me of religious communities. Are religious groups strong candidates for places to build this kind of relationship and climate action?
Yeah, So I think that the religious communities are definitely a place that I mean that are absolutely a place where you could build support for climate action, and there are a couple things I would say about that. So the first is that I think that a lot of movements on the left assume that a lot of the kind of local institutions through which people gather are the purview of the right. So gun clubs are a place of the right. Churches, Christian churches, especially in the United States, have been co-opted by the right. All these kind of things. And that's not necessarily true, right? Like it's just sort of an artifact of how organizing has unfolded over the past generation. Um, and so I think the question is like, how can movements like the climate justice movement reclaim the ability to enter into the spaces where people gather? And one story that I'll tell is that, Ralph Reed is a faith-based organizer on the right who is really important in helping to shape the religious right. And he has a story that he tells where he sort of says, back in the 80s when they were first trying to think about how they organize on the right, they were thinking, and this is his language, what is the housewife like sitting around the kitchen table concerned about? And they thought, well, she's concerned about the moral education of her children, so we're going to organize in schools. And they made schools the kind of Joe's bar of the religious right, where you had that same kind of structure where you have every community has a school. The school has a school board. It has like a set of issues and a curriculum that it's fighting over. And this whole fight around sex ed became a way in which the religious right began to, organize. Not because like sex ed was necessarily the thing that they thought was the most important issue, but because it had that natural link to these like Joe's bar type places in communities across America through which they could begin to develop that sense of common purpose and collective action in a lot of the community constituencies that they were seeking to organize. Oops, sorry. And so I just sort of tell that story by way of saying that like movements can often be really strategic about thinking about where are the places where people naturally gather, and then how do we begin to connect the work that we're doing to those places. And I think faith communities are a place where there's an enormous energy that that we often underestimate, And I will say that just recently, I've been working on a research project where I've been studying the role of evangelical megachurches in organizing, and these are churches that the largest evangelical megachurch in the United States gathers 80,000 people per weekend, and so it's like it outstrips the size of any political organization, and there's surprising ideological heterogeneity in these churches in a way that I think a lot of people don't understand because we have such a sort of homogenous view of what's going on in these churches. And while there is a lot of conservatism, I think there's actually a lot of opportunity, and they're very thoughtful about questions about how do you create structures of belonging, within these communities in ways that I think make them ripe for organizing in a way that other places, aren't necessarily. And then the other thing is just this kind of simple numbers, right? 3/4 of Americans identify as being part of a faith tradition, and so which means that the vast majority of Americans, feel like they have faith commitments that animate some part of their lives, and so not tapping into that is a lost opportunity.
Thank you for that. I'm going to go into the last question. We have about we're kind of coming up on time. A lot of your kind of messaging and work is central around young women, younger people kind of just taking action and kind of becoming these leaders in these spaces. So what's your kind of key takeaway message, advice that you want to share with us today and our viewers, and more specifically, younger women and women of color?
Yeah, I feel like I have a lot. I just feel so lucky to work in a university for many reasons, and one of the reasons why I do is because I have this opportunity to work with students all the time. And one of the things I love about working with students is that it feels like I'm having this like constant dialogue with the future. Because every year you have a new group of students who come in, and every year they bring so much to the table, so I feel like I'm learning as much from them, and I hope they're learning some small little bits of something from me. But it's just like this enormous opportunity. And one of my mentors, a guy named Marshall Gans, who teaches at Harvard, he always says that if you look at the history of social movements throughout the world, it's no accident that young people have always been at the forefront of those social movements. And the reason why they've been at the forefront of those social movements is because it's young people who have a critical eye and a hopeful heart, right? And that's what you need to make a movement work. And so you have to have the critical eye to be able to see the gap between the world as it is and the world as it should be. And if any of you who have, like I've got a teenager and she definitely has a critical eye, let me tell you, and so I think young people naturally have that critical eye, right? But at the same time, they have that hopeful heart, right? They're not jaded like, a lot of my older colleagues are that feel like, well, we've been trying it for however many years now and it's never going to work, right? And so they have that hopeful heart, if for no other reason than they have to, right? Because the world, it's their world that that we're working on. And so I guess what I would say as I think about young people is don't give up that critical eye and that hopeful heart, right? And you have to nurture both to be able to build the kind of movements that we need to make the change that we want. But then the other thing I would say, thinking particularly about women and women of color, is that, I was reading recently an article by George Orwell. He's the novelist and writer who wrote 1984 and other books. And I was reading a letter that he had written, I think it was in the 1930s, to a friend, where he said, I feel like the old world that we're a part of is being sawn off at its legs. Where it felt like everything that they knew was changing. And I think we're in another moment like that right now, where so many of the structures in our society, the structure of our economy, the structure of our politics, the structure of our relationships to each other are fundamentally changing in a way that creates a tremendous amount of uncertainty, and that can create some anxiety. But it also creates this opportunity for imagination, and I think it's not an accident that it's in this moment that we're seeing so many women of color, as we discussed earlier, kind of rising to the forefront of that conversation, because for so often it's the people who are most out that are able to lead us in a conversation about how we imagine a new world, And so I think what I would say to young women and young women of color is to not underestimate the importance of the voice that they have in helping to reimagine what that new world is, because they're the ones that can see how the seams of our old world are falling apart, and they can see both what's inside that old world and what could be possible outside of it, And I think that's an enormous position of creative power to be in, and I look forward to seeing what comes out of those conversations that are going on right now.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think especially in the conservation space, where it took a couple of years for me to be in a meeting at my office where it was a majority people of color. So kind of recognizing that the conservation space does tend to be pretty white. What I've noticed, in recent years, and in the years that I've been doing this work, a lot of the movements and a lot of the kind of conversations are getting started by younger people, and they have so much power in the fact that they understand like there is no other choice but to take action, and so they bring that kind of urgency and that need to the conversation in a way that I think is brand new and just like really powerful. So that's been something that's been really like hopeful for me to see so many different faces, so many different voices, and those stories that get told coming out of this climate justice movement, and and a lot of the other social movements that have come out over the last couple of years. But I think we are at time, and I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us today. And I know personally, as a Korean American, seeing you as an expert and learning about your work, it's made me feel like more confident in my work, and also the whole sense of belonging, right? Like seeing you and kind of seeing these younger generations that we've been talking about, I'm like, oh yeah, I belong in this space. I can take up this space. So I just want to say thank you for that. And then thank you to all of our wonderful producers and everyone behind the scenes who helped make this event flawless. And lastly, thank you to our audiences who tuned in, whether it be live or from a recording. And thank you so much for contributing to this conversation.
Thanks so much for having me, Grace. It was really great and such a privilege to be able to have this conversation with you. So thank you.